are not really a good person if you don't accept abortion as a universal human right, not just a rare and tragic circumstance. If you in any way dare to say that not homosexual persons, but homosexual activity is somehow not ordered correctly according to the will of God or of nature, these things are now formative of all of us, and particularly younger people, in such a way that the faith becomes more and more incomprehensible. In other words, are the media creating a culture where it is practically impossible to believe, in which case it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to be Catholic in this culture in 20, 30, 40 years. There is an implausibility to the faith now that wasn't there 20 years ago, and that's because largely of the entertainment media.
That was Cardinal Francis George. Welcome back to The World Over. He's been called a lion of the American church, a man of deep intelligence, not untouched by suffering. He was the first native Chicagoan to lead that diocese, and he did so for 17 years until his retirement. Cardinal Francis George was laid to rest on Thursday. Joining us to talk about this monumental figure, his legacy, and a few other matters is editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal. Robert, welcome back.
Good to be with you.
Thank you. We heard there that sort of penetrating grasp that Cardinal Francis George had of the American scene and the global scene. What was it like working with him? You collaborated with him on a number of books.
Well, you heard it in that soundbite. There's a broadness of mind, but also a depth of mind and a practicality about what's going on in the world. And he knew that the walls were closing in for the church. And it's not simply the media, it's the universities. He's talked about that. It's the federal government. And the problem starts to be that how does the church even communicate itself other than EWTN? And it's almost like samizdat under the old Soviet Union. We have some methods of communication, but the large parts of the culture now are occupied by what you have to think of as a kind of a counter-Christian culture.
Tell me for a moment, in your estimation, was he the greatest mind in the Bishops' Conference?
Yeah, I think that goes undisputed, and I think many bishops would say that as well. He was the guy who many people who do intellectual work, you talk with him for 2 minutes, and he's not only talking about Aquinas and Plato and Aristotle, but he's talking about American philosophers. He had a PhD in American philosophy. He was talking about William James and Josiah Royce and others. So he knew at great depth what was going on, but also connected with people in a remarkable way.
At his heart, it seemed to me, and I knew Cardinal George from meeting him over the years. I didn't know him with the intimacy that you did. It seemed to me he was a traditionalist at heart. He walked into what was, I don't think it's going out on a limb to say, the toxic waste dump of Bernardin's Chicago. It was a mess. Did he make a dent in the diocese, and what impact do you think he had while there?
Well, I don't live in Chicago, and I think people out there probably need to speak to that. You know, he used to to tell a joke, but it was a true joke, that before he ever thought he would go back to Chicago, he ran into Cardinal Bernardin once and said to him, "Joe, how do you govern a place like Chicago?" And Bernardin started laughing, and he said, "Govern Chicago? Are you kidding? It's by nature ungovernable. Nobody governs Chicago." So it's not even a matter of Cardinal Bernardin was more liberal and Cardinal George was more traditional, if that's the right term for it. It's a place that has, for a very long time, had its own ideas about what Catholicism is. And I believe that he, just by his example and by the brilliance of his presence, that made a big difference. But I hear from many people that they feel that still, in spite of it, as some people say about John Paul II and about Pope Benedict, that as great as they were, the Church didn't really make the turn that they had hoped for.
Of course, he established that community of St. John Cancius downtown there.
And appointed Father Robert Barron to the Mundelein Seminary, who's just been a brilliant apologist for the faith.
So there are certain bits of the legacy that remain there. I want to talk a moment about his disability, which he and I talked about. I'll play this bite. I want your reaction. I know you walk with some difficulty due to a bout with polio as a child. Can you tell us how that has affected the way you've carried your office in Chicago and the way you'll carry yourself as a cardinal?
I mean, I've come to terms with it, I think, long ago, so it's not going to affect what I do here any differently than it affected what I did elsewhere. I come, I suppose, with a certain sensitivity to physical and also mental and psychological disabilities, a sense of identification. I'm the national moderator, the Episcopal moderator for the National Catholic Office for People with Disabilities. I'm very interested in the disability community because I'm part of it. So that necessarily affects perhaps my mission, but it also helps me to, I think, come to terms with limits. I've tried to do that through my life because you're limited, and also an appreciation of the way in which weakness has to be visible in the community in order to call forth the generosity of others.
He did have a real heart for the disabled community.
Yeah, I'm not from Chicago, but I used to go out quite a bit, and when we would be working on the books, I would go out to dinners with him or events of one sort or another, and it was remarkable to me how much drive he had. That, I'm a considerably younger man than he was when he died, and at the end of the day, he was still raring to go, and he was out there, and it's because I think, as many people who have handicaps and have overcome them do, he just became very dedicated, and he decided that he wouldn't let it stop him. And Father Robert Barron has said that the very first lecture that he, or talk he gave to the priests of the Archdiocese of Chicago, as Archbishop of Chicago, he said to them, never feel sorry for yourself. In other words, you've got a beautiful mission, you've got a beautiful vocation, and I think that energized with him, with whoever he was. And I've seen it with ordinary groups, Catholic and non-Catholic, who just warmed to him because they knew that that was a real part of him.
He really did not like the politicization of the church. We talked about that. Listen to this and please react. Can you lament the politicization of everything, how we see everything now through these political prisms? To what do you attribute that? How did we get here?
Part of it might be that so many other areas of civil society that make up a culture are now weakened, the family particularly, and politics then, instead of being the part of our public life that governs part of our life, citizens, but there's a whole civil society is much broader than that, has been allowed to move into areas that it has no business being in, including the church. So political and conservative polarization, those are political, or liberal, those are political terms, they're not ecclesiastical terms. For us, the terms are true and false, or good and evil. Those are the divisions that count.
True and false, good and evil.
Yeah, and I heard him talk about this many times, and we had private conversations quite often about it. But part of the difficulty is that the church, with its claims to truth, also has to be able to enter into the public square. I mean, he has at the beginning of his book, God in Action, he disclaims that the church is outside, or that God is outside, that it's always at work inside of everything, because God is present, and the church needs to be present to all sectors of society, to the whole universe for that matter. But the difficulty is, with these truths that the church has, how can it speak? Where can it act? So it has got to find some allies in the public square. And this, unfortunately, because of the domination of the political process in these days, and the lack of civil society, the lack of the church's own instruments to speak. This means that we're constantly looking for allies who can speak for us in the public square, and unfortunately that means the political parties. And the political parties, God love them, have their value and their disvalue.
Yeah, and their own agenda at many times. He had this quote, you wrote of this in your remembrance of him that I'm going to put on the Facebook page. It's so beautiful and moving. The quote you mentioned, and I do think he'll be remembered for this, is, I expect to die in my bed, my successor will die in prison, and his successor will die a martyr in the public square. His successor will pick up the shards of the ruined society and slowly help rebuild civilization, as the church has done so often in human history. Is that being dramatic or prophetic?
I used to joke with him that when his health was good, that maybe he was a little too optimistic, because dying in his bed at times didn't seem like what was going to even happen for him.
Yeah.
But maybe the generations are a little bit too short. I think that we're very likely, and I'm just guessing as any of us would at this point, but it seems to me that the church is going to pass through more than just 1 or 2 generations before it gets its chance to make a turn. the country is in serious trouble. It's in serious trouble internally, it's in serious trouble internationally. And the contrast, as he said, between, say, the 1980s and 1990s, when Father Richard John Newhouse could talk about a Catholic moment in the United States, couldn't be starker. It's hard to know where the church, where even Christianity in a more general sense can find a place to present itself, a foothold or a grip in this sort of culture. So I think that progression is right. The church has survived the fall of whole civilizations, the Roman Empire, the medieval synthesis. So we'll come back. But how quickly we'll come back, I think he might have been a little optimistic.
In November, this past November, we spoke. It was the last interview I did with him. And we talked about Pope Francis and the last synod. He had this to say.
If there was some difficulty in interpreting what was going on, I think it was more because of what was hinted at. That is, they didn't follow the rules.
No.
They didn't follow the Vademecum. They didn't follow. So the methodology seemed up for grabs. The church is not up for grabs, but the way of doing a synod suddenly seems to be very uncertain. You have a plan for synods, and it's not being followed. Yeah. And some of the report, for example, that
midterm report,
evidently it did not reflect what was being said. Now, how did that happen? That has not been answered yet, and that's going to be a question that should be pursued. So it isn't that the church is up for grabs, it's that this synod's method didn't follow the book, and so people didn't know what to expect next.
People didn't know what to expect next. He was disturbed about the direction of the church at the end.
Well, as you know, Raymond, he also made several public statements about how the Holy Father, he wished he could speak with the Holy Father because he wasn't sure that the people around him were making clear that he was creating some confusion by some of the things that he said. It wasn't that Cardinal George believed that he was actually teaching things that were contrary to the faith. It's just that people were unclear. I think what you also hear in that soundbite is him, the man who was the president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, who knew that Robert's Rules of Order, that the procedures that are necessary to run a meeting are quite important because they help with the outcome. That if what you begin to do is to sort of improvise along the way, well, then these sorts of disorders and things get inserted. And as you know, I was in Rome when that interim report came out, and everyone was shocked, including the veteran reporters in Rome themselves. And then the very next day, the bishops themselves came out and did a 180-degree turn and said, that's not what we were talking about, that this somehow was slipped into the actual text, and they more or less denied that, and in the final report, we got something that was better. But the procedure, a man who had actually worked in a circumstance where an organization has to follow an orderly procedure, he knew that that was an important part of getting to and proclaiming the truth. Yeah,
it's sad he wasn't stronger in those last days. He would have been the perfect person to go and be one of the American representatives at this synod. He reflected at the end of our interview on how God was preparing him for eternity. Listen to this.
I think the Lord, in His goodness, prepares us to meet Him face to face, by stripping away a lot of accoutrements of life and desires, even good desires, so that in the end there's one thing necessary, that is the love of God. And I kind of sense that I'm being helped in that way, that the Lord is preparing me, despite my unworthiness, to meet Him. Because it's when you stop to think about it, what does that mean? To see God, we say. We can't see without eyes. So what are you talking about? It's a true vision. We see. How does the spirit see? Because we're part spirit, and that's the part that survives death until the resurrection. So there are just all kinds of questions that I can't answer. You can't, I don't think. St. Thomas couldn't exactly. No. So there's all that to be considered as you try to say, what must I do to prepare for death? The importance of your life is that it prepares you to live forever with God. And so it's very important that at the end of your life, you can sum it up and hand it over to Him. Here it is, Lord. Purify me and help me.
I love the end of that. Purify me and help me. What's his final legacy, do you think?
Well, that is one of them. I mean, I'm going to make a bold comparison. It reminds me a little bit of St. Thomas Aquinas at the end of his life when he said, "All I have written is as straw."
Right.
So, you know, these great world-class intellectual figures who are really spiritual men know at the end of the day that it comes down to being able to hand yourself, to commend your own spirit to God. I think he leaves the church with a certain pride in the way that the episcopacy, the American episcopacy, can conduct itself. It hasn't always done that. No organization ever is 100% perfect. But he was certainly one of the men. He was the head of his own religious order, the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, and was involved in missionary work on 6 different continents, which he used to talk about quite a bit. It was that great period of that open America that went out into the world and preached the gospel and kept the faith here at home in a culture that is not always open to Catholicism. He was a great man. I have to say, it really hit me hard when the news came. I knew it was coming, but the day that I actually saw it, I really felt that something had passed not only out of my life, but out of the life of American Catholicism and America.
Yeah, no, I shared that feeling. It was not unexpected, but it was sort of shocking when it happened.